Imagine being so stunningly beautiful that a German crown prince gives you his ring, so brilliant that you teach yourself ancient Greek for fun, and so captivating that you steal a duke from his American heiress wife, only to destroy your face with an experimental cosmetic procedure at age 21. Then spend decades as a duke's mistress before finally marrying him, and watch that marriage implode in spectacular fashion involving revolvers and toy flashlights, only to end your days in a psychiatric hospital with dead cats in your refrigerator and newspapers stacked to the ceiling. That was Gladys Deacon's life, and if you think that summary sounds unhinged, wait until you hear the details. Gladys was born beautiful and brilliant into an era that didn't quite know what to do with women who were both. She was painted by the greatest artists of the Belle Époque, pursued by European royalty, and described as one of the most fascinating women of her generation. She spoke multiple languages, could discuss philosophy with scholars, and had the kind of devastating wit that made her the center of attention in any room she entered. Then she did something that sounds absolutely insane even by today's Instagram filter standards. She went through an experimental medical procedure that basically ruined her life. But that's just one chapter in a life that reads like someone took every possible scandalous element from a dozen different period dramas and crammed them into one person's biography. We're talking murder, affairs, royal entanglements, a decades-long campaign to steal another woman's husband, mental illness, World War I, Nazi sympathies, aggressive geese, and an ending that involves being forcibly removed from a farmhouse filled with chaos and delusion. If you're watching with tired eyes and an overthinking mind, this story is for you. If you really enjoy these bedtime journeys through history, please like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love knowing where these stories are keeping you company. Tonight, we're meeting Gladys Deacon's, society beauty, intellectual, homewrecker, duchess, and a cautionary tale about what happens when you're too smart, too beautiful, and too unconventional for the world you're born into. Spoiler alert, it doesn't end well. But the journey is absolutely fascinating. Gladys Marie Deacon's was born on February 7th, 1881, in Paris, which sounds very glamorous until you learn that her childhood was essentially a Victorian Gothic nightmare with an American accent. Her parents were Edward Parker Deacon and Florence Baldwin, wealthy Americans who'd moved to Paris because that's what wealthy Americans did when they wanted to seem cultured. Edward came from money, Florence came from more money, and together they created a household that was less American expatriates living the dream in Paris, and more pressure cooker of jealousy and violence waiting to explode. Edward was insanely, pathologically jealous. The kind of jealousy that makes modern toxic relationships look like healthy communication workshops. He was convinced Florence was having affairs, which, to be fair, she eventually was. Probably because being married to a violently jealous man makes infidelity start looking like a reasonable life choice. Gladys grew up in this atmosphere of suffocating tension, watching her father's paranoia consume their household, witnessing the fights, the accusations, the escalating violence. It's the kind of childhood that either destroys you completely or turns you into someone fascinatingly complicated. Gladys chose option 2. Florence did eventually have an affair with a French naval officer named Émile François Abbé, because apparently she decided that if Edward was going to accuse her constantly anyway, she might as well actually do it. This is not recommended relationship advice, but it's understandable. Edward, whose jealousy had reached levels that would get you banned from multiple subreddits today, found out about the affair. And his response was not to file for divorce, not to demand counseling, not to do any of the reasonable things one might do upon discovering infidelity. No. Edward Parker Deacon got a gun, tracked down Émile Abbé, and shot him. Dead. In front of witnesses. Because he was apparently committed to making the absolute worst decision possible in every situation. This was 1892. Gladys was 11 years old. She witnessed her father commit murder, or at least dealt with the immediate aftermath, which is exactly the kind of childhood trauma that therapists would have a field day with if therapy had been a thing in the 1890s. Edward was arrested, tried, and sentenced to prison, The trial was a massive scandal. A wealthy American shoots his wife's French lover in Paris. The kind of international incident that newspapers loved because it combined sex, violence, wealth, and multiple nationalities. Gladys's family was now infamous for all the wrong reasons, and she was just entering adolescence. Florence, suddenly a widow in all but legal terms with 4 daughters to raise, did her best to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She sent Gladys to the Convent de l'Assomption in Paris for formal schooling, probably hoping that nuns could provide some stability after the murder situation. But Edward wasn't done making terrible decisions from prison. He demanded custody of his children, apparently believing that a man who'd just murdered someone in a jealous rage was an excellent parental choice. The custody battle dragged on, with Gladys caught in the middle of her parents' dysfunction. Eventually, Florence agreed to let Edward take Gladys to America when he was released, probably because fighting a murder conviction and a custody battle simultaneously was exhausting even by Gilded Age standards of family drama. So Gladys sailed to America with her father, the man who'd murdered someone, been imprisoned, and was now somehow allowed to have custody of his child. They settled in Newport, Rhode Island, that playground of wealthy Americans where enormous cottages lined the coast, and everyone pretended that ostentatious displays of wealth were perfectly normal and not at all gauche. Gladys attended the Howard Seminary for Women, getting an American education while living with a father whose mental state was deteriorating rapidly. Edward was unraveling, his paranoia and violence giving way to something darker and more unstable. He wasn't just jealous anymore, he was genuinely losing his grip on reality. Florence kept trying to regain custody, probably recognizing that leaving Gladys with Edward was like leaving someone in a house that was actively on fire. But the legal system moved slowly, and Gladys remained trapped with her increasingly unstable father. During this period, Gladys developed the interests that would define her life. She played the mandolin, loved opera, was obsessed with Sarah Bernhardt, the great actress who was basically the Beyoncé of the Belle Époque, and took up painting. She was becoming cultured, intellectual, artistic, all while living with a man who'd murdered someone and was slowly going mad. Then came the news that would captivate Gladys's imagination. Consuelo Vanderbilt, the 18-year-old daughter of one of America's wealthiest families, was engaged to the Duke of Marlborough. An American heiress was going to become a duchess, marry into one of England's most prestigious families, and live in Blenheim Palace. Gladys, still in her early teens, became fascinated with this story. The romance, the title, the palace. It represented everything glamorous and sophisticated about European aristocracy. She had no idea that years later she would steal Consuelo's husband, become the Duchess herself, and discover that living in Blenheim Palace was actually a cold, miserable experience that no amount of prestige could make comfortable. Edward's mental state continued to deteriorate until his family finally committed him to McLean Hospital. Yes, the same famous psychiatric institution that would later house Sylvia Plath and other notable troubled minds. Edward died there in 1901, taking his paranoia, violence, and madness with him and finally freeing Gladys from his shadow. She was 20 years old, had witnessed her father commit murder, survived years of custody battles and instability, and was now free to become whoever she wanted to be. Unfortunately, what she wanted to be was the most fascinating, beautiful, captivating woman in European society. A goal she would achieve and then systematically destroy through a combination of bad decisions and catastrophic luck. With Edward dead and Florence back in control, Gladys was finally able to pursue the European education and lifestyle she'd been denied during her chaotic childhood. She went to Bonn, Germany, for formal education, but that wasn't enough for someone with Gladys's intellectual appetite. She taught herself ancient Greek and Latin. Not casually, not as a hobby, but seriously studied them to the point where she could read classical texts in their original languages. This was not normal behavior for a young society woman in 1900. Most wealthy girls were learning enough French to order in restaurants and enough art history to sound cultured at dinner parties. Gladys was reading Homer in ancient Greek for fun. She entered Belle Époque society. that glittering world of parties, balls, and social maneuvering that existed in the brief period between the Victorian era's stuffiness and World War I's destruction of everything. It was a time when wealthy Europeans and Americans mixed in Paris, Rome, and London, when art and culture flourished, when everything seemed elegant and endless and sophisticated. And Gladys was stunning, not just pretty, genuinely, remarkably beautiful, in a way that made artists desperate to paint her. Giovanni Boldini and Paul César Helot, two of the era's most celebrated portrait painters, both captured her beauty. Her face appeared in exhibitions, her image was discussed in fashionable circles, and she became one of those women whose beauty was itself a form of social currency. She had this combination of classical beauty and sharp intelligence that was both magnetic and slightly threatening. Men found her fascinating. Women found her intimidating. She could discuss philosophy with scholars, then turn around and devastate someone with a perfectly timed cutting remark. She was becoming legendary. There was a scandalous visit to San Francisco with her mother that resulted in her uncle resigning from his country club. The details are lost to history, but the fact that the scandal was significant enough to force a resignation suggests Gladys was already pushing boundaries and not particularly caring about consequences. Back in Paris, she threw herself into intense study, brushing off suitors with the casual disdain of someone who knew she was too interesting for most of the men pursuing her. She wasn't playing hard to get. She genuinely found most of her admirers boring compared to her books and intellectual pursuits. This is when she met Bernard Berenson, the famous art historian and critic. Berenson was brilliant, cultured, married to Mary Costello Berenson, and absolutely infatuated with Gladys. He wasn't alone. Lots of men were infatuated with Gladys. But Berenson was important because his wife, Mary, left extensive records of her opinions about Gladys, and those opinions were not positive. Mary Berenson saw through Gladys in ways that others didn't. She recognized the recklessness, the compulsive lying, the tendency to create drama and chaos. Mary understood that Gladys wasn't just charmingly unconventional. She was genuinely unstable in ways that would eventually cause serious problems. But Berenson didn't care about his wife's warnings. He was obsessed with Gladys, writing her letters, seeking her company, completely under her spell. Gladys, for her part, enjoyed the attention, but wasn't particularly interested in Berenson romantically. She collected admirers the way other people collected art. They were proof of her power and appeal, but she didn't actually want most of them. During this period, Gladys also dealt with physical and emotional struggles that she described in letters, using language that suggested she felt her body was hermaphrodite, not quite fitting into the female mold she was expected to inhabit. Whether this was about her physiology, her personality, or the general difficulty of being an intellectual woman in an era that preferred women to be decorative rather than thoughtful, we can't know for certain. But she felt different, wrong somehow, trapped in expectations that didn't fit. She inspired F. Marion Crawford's novel, The Heroine of Cecilia, becoming a literary character, even as she was living her actual life. This was peak Gladys. Beautiful, brilliant, fascinating, inspiring art and literature. The kind of woman people couldn't stop talking about. And then she met the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough, Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, known as Sonny, and his wife Consuelo Vanderbilt, the American heiress Gladys had read about years earlier. Sonny's marriage to Consuelo was famously unhappy. Consuelo had been essentially forced to marry him by her mother Alva Vanderbilt, who wanted a title for her daughter and was willing to sacrifice Consuelo's happiness to get it. Sonny needed money. Blenheim Palace was enormously expensive to maintain, and Consuelo came with an enormous dowry. It was a transaction disguised as a marriage, and both of them were miserable. Gladys looked at this situation and apparently thought, I could fix him. Spoiler, she could not fix him. Nobody could fix Sonny, because Sonny was fundamentally a cold, emotionally distant aristocrat who viewed marriage as a duty rather than a relationship. But Gladys was young, beautiful, brilliant, and convinced of her own powers of fascination. The stage was set for one of the most prolonged, scandalous marriage-wrecking campaigns in Belle Époque history. In 1901, Gladys arrived at Blenheim Palace, that massive Baroque monument to aristocratic excess that had been weighing down the Marlborough family for generations. The place was enormous, cold, expensive, and impressive in the way that makes you think, this seems like a lot of maintenance, rather than, I want to live here. But Gladys was enchanted. The history, the grandeur, the sheer aristocratic prestige of the place, it represented everything she found romantic about European nobility. She was 20 years old, stunning, and about to insert herself into a marriage in ways that would make modern marriage counselors weep. Both Sunny and Consuelo were drawn to her immediately. Consuelo, trapped in a loveless marriage and starved for genuine friendship, found Gladys fascinating and fun. Sunny, trapped in the same loveless marriage and equally starved for emotional connection, found Gladys absolutely captivating. Gladys became a fixture at Blenheim, visiting regularly, bringing life and energy to a place that was famously gloomy despite its grandeur. She was that friend who makes everything more interesting, who turns a boring dinner party into an event, who makes you feel like the most fascinating person in the room when she's talking to you. Then, Crown Prince Wilhelm of Prussia, the heir to the German throne, future Kaiser Wilhelm II, one of the most powerful positions in Europe, became completely infatuated with Gladys. They exchanged rings, which in royal circles was basically an unofficial engagement. This should have been Gladys's moment to become a future empress, to achieve the ultimate social triumph. But Gladys wasn't interested in marrying Wilhelm. She was already fixated on Sunny, Duke of Marlborough, despite the fact that he was married to her friend Consuelo. Or perhaps because he was married to Consuelo. There's something about wanting what you can't have that makes the wanting more intense. Mary Berenson, watching from a distance, was horrified. She could see what was happening, could see Gladys's recklessness and her tendency to create chaos, and she knew this would end badly. But Gladys didn't care about Mary's opinions. She was becoming an iconic figure in London society, admired for her beauty and wit, and she was determined to have Sunny Marlborough. The fact that Sunny was married, that Consuelo was her friend, that this whole situation was ethically dubious at best, none of that mattered to Gladys. She wanted what she wanted, and what she wanted was to be the Duchess of Marlborough. This is where Gladys's story takes a turn from scandalous society beauty into cautionary tale about the dangers of experimental cosmetic procedures. Gladys was beautiful, genuinely remarkably beautiful, painted by famous artists, pursued by royalty, admired by everyone. But she had a tiny imperfection, a slight dip in her nose, barely noticeable, the kind of thing that literally no one else cared about but that she became obsessed with. In 1902, cosmetic surgery was not the refined medical specialty it is today. There were no board certifications, no standardized procedures, no peer-reviewed studies. There were just doctors willing to try experimental things on people vain enough to let them. Gladys found a doctor willing to inject paraffin wax into her nose to smooth out that barely there dip. Paraffin wax, the same substance used to make candles. This doctor was going to inject it into her face to fix a flaw that most people couldn't even see. If you're thinking, this sounds like an absolutely terrible idea, you're correct. It was an absolutely terrible idea. But Gladys was 21, beautiful, convinced that fixing this one tiny flaw would make her perfect. And the concept of informed consent didn't really exist yet. The procedure went horrifically wrong. The wax didn't stay put. It migrated, hardened, caused necrosis, tissue death, and essentially destroyed her face from the inside. Her nose began to collapse, her features distorted, and what had been one of the most beautiful faces of the Belle Époque became a slowly deteriorating medical disaster. The scandal was worldwide. Newspapers reported on Gladys Deacon'S botched cosmetic surgery, discussing her disfigurement with a kind of gleeful horror that makes you realize people have always loved Schadenfreude. We just have Twitter now instead of scandal sheets. Gladys had to recover from this catastrophe both physically and psychologically. she was committed to Dr. Paul Solier's Sanatorium for Nervous Disorders, basically a fancy rest home for wealthy people having mental breakdowns, while her face healed as much as it was going to heal, which wasn't much. Her beauty was gone. Not entirely. She was still striking, still had those piercing eyes and commanding presence. But the face that artists had painted, that Crown Prince Wilhelm had wanted to marry, was destroyed, and it was destroyed by her own vanity, her own inability to accept a minor imperfection that no one else even noticed. The psychological impact was devastating. Gladys had built much of her identity on being beautiful, on the power that beauty gave her, on the doors it opened and the attention it commanded. Now she was disfigured, and she had done it to herself. While Gladys was dealing with the aftermath of her disastrous cosmetic surgery, she managed to make things worse by sabotaging her sister Audrey's social debut. The details aren't fully recorded, but apparently Gladys, still reeling from her own catastrophe, couldn't bear to watch her younger sister enjoy the social success and attention that Gladys herself had lost. Then, Audrey became gravely ill and died. Florence's reaction to losing her daughter was cold, almost clinical, suggesting that emotional warmth was not a strong trait in the Deacon family. Gladys, consumed with grief and possibly guilt over having sabotaged Audrey's brief moment of happiness, lashed out at her aristocratic circle. She had always been sharp-tongued, but now her wit turned cruel. She said cutting things that hurt people, burned bridges with former friends, and generally made herself increasingly isolated. When you're beautiful and brilliant, people tolerate your sharp edges. When you're disfigured and brilliant, those same sharp edges make people avoid you. Gladys and Florence settled at Palazzo Borghese in Rome, where Florence had an affair with Prince Alfonso Doria Pamphili, because apparently having affairs with European nobility was a Deacon family tradition. Gladys's standing in Roman society began to crumble as her erratic moods and cutting remarks drove people away. Then doctors discovered that Gladys had a congenital uterine defect, which explained the lifelong morning sickness she'd experienced. This defect would make pregnancy difficult or impossible, which in an era when a woman's primary purpose was considered to be producing heirs, was another devastating blow to her already complicated life. By 1906, the Duke of Marlborough was moving toward divorce from Consuelo. Interestingly, Gladys's name didn't appear in the divorce papers, despite everyone knowing about their relationship. Consuelo had her own affairs to deal with. She wasn't exactly faithful either in this loveless marriage, and the whole thing was a mess of mutual infidelity and aristocratic propriety. Sonny formally separated from Consuelo in 1907, and Gladys presumably thought her moment had finally come. But divorce among the aristocracy was complicated, requiring legal maneuvering and social approval, and Sonny wasn't in any hurry. Gladys had a brief engagement to Lord Brooke, which was possibly quashed by King Edward VII himself, suggesting that even royalty was meddling in her love life. She also had a romance with Count Hermann von Keyserling, who actually proposed, but Gladys turned him down because she was still fixated on Sonny Marlborough. Her behaviour was becoming increasingly coarse and cynical. The brilliant, charming girl who'd captivated Paris society was turning into someone harder, more bitter, retreating into isolation. Her mental health was fraying. She wrote letters expressing a longing for death, contemplating suicide, describing a spiritual emptiness that no amount of social success could fill. Meanwhile, her sisters were moving on with their lives. Dorothy got engaged and married Prince Abba Radziwill. Florence tried unsuccessfully to marry Edith to a European noble, and Edith eventually married Henry G. Grey, an American. The American press crowned Gladys the most tragic of the three American graces, which was probably not the title she'd hoped for when she was 20 and beautiful. Gladys continued as Sonny's mistress while Consuelo held the title of Duchess. It was a humiliating position. Everyone knew about them, but she had no official standing, no security, no guarantee that Sonny would ever actually marry her. Years passed. Her wax-damaged face continued to deteriorate. Marta Bibesco, a Romanian princess and notorious gossip, made cruel remarks about Gladys's appearance, and the social circle that had once celebrated her beauty now whispered about her disfigurement. Even Sunny started avoiding her sometimes, which must have been devastating. She destroyed her face trying to be perfect for him, wrecked her reputation to be his mistress, waited years for him to divorce Consuelo, and he was already pulling away before they were even married. World War I broke out in 1914 and completely undid Gladys's already fragile world. The glittering Belle Époque society she'd thrived in was gone, replaced by the horror and chaos of modern warfare. Gladys threw herself into war relief work, writing bleak prophetic letters about the destruction she saw coming. Prince Doria, her mother's lover, died, leaving Florence devastated and financially ruined. Gladys's own funds were dwindling. The dazzling life of parties and art and sophisticated conversation was vanishing, replaced by rationing, fear, and grief. She experienced a profound spiritual emptiness, contemplating retreating to a convent or ending her life. The war had stripped away all the superficial glamour that had sustained her, leaving only the fundamental unhappiness underneath. Sunny wanted to divorce Consuelo and marry Gladys, but there was royal resistance to the divorce, and wartime legal complications made everything more difficult. Gladys's health was crumbling again, and Sunny's response was distant, distracted by his own concerns. A German artillery strike in Paris nearly killed Gladys. She survived, but it was another reminder that the world was falling apart and nothing was certain anymore. Then Florence died in 1918 after working with the Farnese Relief Fund. Gladys lost her mother, her first heart bond, as she called Florence, and the grief was profound. Despite their complicated relationship, despite Florence's coldness and her questionable parenting decisions, Gladys had loved her mother. Now she was alone. After the armistice, Gladys withdrew to the south of France, exhausted and grieving. She had a final, explosive falling out with Bernard Berenson, ending that decades-long complicated friendship. Dorothy was continuing her scandals and getting divorced. The whole family seemed determined to create maximum drama. Gladys sued the Daily Graphic for falsely claiming she'd had an affair with the German crown prince. Defending her reputation, even though her reputation was already fairly shredded by her years as Sunny's mistress. Finally, Consuelo agreed to divorce Marlborough so she could marry Jacques Balsan, a wealthy French businessman who actually seemed to love her. The way was clear for Sunny to marry Gladys. He proposed. After nearly 20 years of knowing each other, years of her being his mistress, years of waiting and hoping and destroying her life for him, Sunny Marlborough finally proposed. Gladys's response was to demand a religious ceremony, which was complicated because Sunny was divorced and the Church of England wasn't thrilled about blessing remarriages. There were negotiations, complications, delays. Nothing about this romance had ever been simple. They had a civil wedding at the British consulate in Paris in June 1921, followed by a religious ceremony in someone's drawing room because they couldn't have it in a proper church. Gladys was 40 years old, her face was damaged, and she was finally marrying the man she'd fixated on for 2 decades. They returned to Blenheim Palace, and Gladys became the Duchess of Marlborough. She'd achieved her goal. She was living in the palace that had captivated her imagination 20 years earlier. She had the title, the position, the aristocratic status she'd wanted, and almost immediately she realized she'd made a terrible mistake. As she would later say, she'd married a house, not a man. Blenheim Palace was enormous, beautiful, historically significant, and absolutely miserable to actually live in. The food arrived cold because the kitchens were so far from the dining rooms. There weren't enough decent bathrooms. There was no telephone. This was 1921, and they didn't have a telephone in one of England's grandest palaces. Gladys's relationship with her stepsons, Sunny's children with Consuelo, was strained. They were loyal to their mother and viewed Gladys as the woman who'd stolen their father. The Churchill family, related to Sunny through Winston Churchill's father, also treated Gladys coldly. Oxfordshire society was even worse. They were loyal to Consuelo, who'd been a good duchess, charitable and kind, and they viewed Gladys as an interloper and homewrecker. She was ostracized, excluded from social events, treated with barely disguised contempt. The ultimate humiliation came at Buckingham Palace when Queen Mary personally barred Gladys from a garden party. This was the Queen sending a clear message. Gladys might technically be a duchess, but she wasn't respectable, wasn't accepted, wasn't one of them. Gladys became pregnant, something doctors had said would be difficult due to her uterine defect. She miscarried. Privately, she felt relieved, which tells you everything about her state of mind. She didn't want Sonny's child. She didn't want to be tied more permanently to this cold man and this miserable palace. She longed for France, for the warmth and culture of Paris and Rome, feeling cut off from her real home. The gloom deepened. She came to loathe London, loathe Blenheim, loathe the whole life she'd fought so hard to achieve. They hosted Spanish royals and other exhausting visitors. Gladys commissioned sculptor Jacob Epstein to create busts of herself and Sonny, leading to clashes because Epstein had his own artistic vision, and Gladys had very specific ideas about how she wanted to be portrayed. She miscarried again after a quarrel with Marlborough. Stress, unhappiness, and her uterine defect making pregnancy nearly impossible. She had an appendectomy and a long convalescence. Then she inherited money from Moraine Baldwin. A brief financial windfall. She became pregnant again, miscarried again, and this time suffered permanent eye damage from chloroform burns during the medical procedure. Because apparently, Gladys's body was determined to accumulate as many medical catastrophes as possible. Sonny drifted deeper into Roman Catholicism, which created another rift in their already troubled marriage. Then Consuelo obtained a Vatican annulment of her marriage to Marlborough, which in Catholic terms meant the marriage had never existed, which technically made Sonny's children with Consuelo illegitimate in the Church's eyes. A whole theological mess that nobody asked for. Gladys distrusted the Church and dreaded pregnancy, creating further distance between herself and Sonny. Sonny, bitter about how his life had turned out, sold his personal papers for money, which was a sign that the Marlborough fortune wasn't what it used to be. Gladys began putting her peculiar stamp on Blenheim. She had eyes painted on the portico ceiling. Her eyes, staring down at anyone who entered. She commissioned sphinxes carved with her face. She was marking the palace as hers, even as her marriage fell apart. She became obsessed with breeding King Charles spaniels, and not in a normal hobby way. There are now so many dogs at Blenheim that they're literally overrunning the palace way. Spaniels everywhere, peeing on priceless furniture, creating chaos and stench. She made one last tender trip to Paris to nurse her childhood nanny, Irma Deodat, staying with her until she died. It was one of the few genuinely loving relationships in Gladys's life, and she honoured it to the end. Her beloved spaniel Snowflake died, and Gladys had the dog taxidermied, keeping its preserved corpse because letting go was not something Gladys did well. Then came the scandalous dinners where Gladys threatened Marlborough with a revolver, except it later turned out to be a toy flashlight shaped like a revolver, which makes the whole thing simultaneously less dangerous and more absurd. Marlborough retreated from Blenheim, pouring his fortune into horses, avoiding his wife. Gladys accused him of cowardice and hired detectives to expose his affairs because she was not going down quietly. The 1929 stock market crash wiped out Gladys's Deacon's trust, leaving her financially dependent on Marlborough, exactly the vulnerable position she'd never wanted to be in. Marlborough formally accused her of disturbing his peace and mismanaging Blenheim. Gladys's lawyers demanded full disclosure of his wealth for the divorce proceedings. Marlborough's side painted her as unstable, claiming she'd chased him with a revolver. That toy flashlight again. Doctors described her profound melancholy. Gladys appealed to her stepson Ivor for help, but he remained neutral, unwilling to take sides between his father and his stepmother. Marlborough blocked her from Blenheim and fired staff loyal to her. Gladys was forced out, posing on the steps for a famous photograph captioned, "Goodbye to all that," dramatic to the end. Marlborough stopped household costs and gave her a grudging monthly allowance. Gladys reappeared in public to defy rumours of madness. Marlborough reclaimed Blenheim, while Churchill's circle whispered that Gladys was deranged. Gladys barricaded herself in Carlton House Terrace, surviving a siege by Marlborough's men trying to evict her. She was fighting with everything she had, refusing to simply disappear. Marlborough rewrote his will to cut her out entirely. Legal battles raged over belongings, including that taxidermied snowflake. Gladys hired Detective Maud West to shadow Marlborough and uncover his affairs. Her draft divorce petition was brutal, citing cruelty and physical abuse. The battle dragged through 1934, with Gladys feeling utterly betrayed. Her finances collapsed. Cartier sued her for debts. Then Marlborough became terminally ill with cancer. He died on June 30, 1934, at age 62, ending the marriage and the war simultaneously. Gladys retreated to the countryside, quietly grieving. Consuelo returned to Blenheim as matriarch, reclaiming her position now that both Sonny and his troublesome second wife were out of the picture. Gladys refused to use the title Duchess, calling herself Mrs. Spencer, or Widow Marlborough, rejecting the identity she'd fought so hard for. Rumours of her madness grew. She dumped water on a journalist's head, confirming people's worst suspicions. Bernard Berenson called her a mythic cat in human form, which was either profound or meaningless, but definitely memorable. She sued a magazine for implying she'd had an affair with a clergyman, still defending the Marlborough name even after everything. Then she slipped fully from public life, appearing only occasionally at Simpson's or the Ritz, ghost-like. She bought Grange Farm in Chacombe as her final refuge, a farmhouse where she could be left alone. Her eccentricity became legendary. Battered boots, painted legs, aggressive geese she kept as guards. Villagers nicknamed her Old Dutch or the Witch. During World War II, she ignored blackout orders, admired Hitler, sneered at Churchill, making herself even more unpopular in a village trying to survive the war. Her bond with helper Agnes Grills frayed over the years, and then Grills died, leaving Gladys even more isolated. May Hobbs came as a helper, dealing with Gladys's demanding yet fascinating behaviour. The woman was difficult, certainly, but never boring. Her sisters had stopped speaking to her. Dorothy was backing the Nazi regime, which tells you everything about the Deacon family's collective judgment. Edith was more reasonable, sending food parcels, but the relationship was distant. The war brought hardship, German bombers overhead, a fox killing her chickens, severe burns from an accident. German prisoners of war were assigned to prune her apple trees, which must have been a surreal experience for everyone involved. Gladys mourned lost friends and filled diaries with biting remarks about everyone and everything. Her appearance became increasingly unkempt, missing teeth, wild hair. She blamed her isolation on the wounds from her marriage, and she wasn't entirely wrong. A man named Andrei Kwiatkowski was hired as a handyman. Initially, she refused to let him enter her house, conducting all business at the door like he was a vampire who needed an invitation. Her schedule was Proustian. She slept during the day, rose at dusk, lived nocturnally like some eccentric creature who decided that regular human hours were beneath her. She marked his car tires to check if he was actually working or just claiming to work, displaying the paranoia that had been growing for decades. Finally, she allowed Andrei inside, and he discovered the chaos: cat corpses in the refrigerator, newspapers stacked waist-high throughout the house, no functioning plumbing, and a revolver always kept near her. This wasn't eccentricity anymore. This was someone who'd completely lost touch with normal living conditions, but still maintained enough cunning to keep outsiders away. To the villagers of Chacombe, she was a ghost story, the witch in the farmhouse, who kept aggressive geese and dumped water on anyone who came too close. Children dared each other to approach her property. She'd become local folklore, a cautionary tale told to scare people. Consuelo Balsan, formerly Consuelo Vanderbilt, Duchess of Marlborough, published her memoirs and completely erased Gladys from the story, calling her rather mad in the few brief mentions she couldn't avoid. This was Consuelo's revenge, not engaging with Gladys directly, just writing her out of history as if she'd barely existed. Near age 80, Gladys's health began failing. She broke her shoulder and refused hospital care, preferring to suffer in her chaos rather than submit to medical authority. On March 15, 1962, men in white coats arrived and forcibly removed her from Chacombe. She was 81 years old, being dragged from her home against her will, taken to St. Andrew's Psychiatric Hospital. Upon arrival, she reclaimed her title, Duchess of Marlborough. After years of refusing it, calling herself Mrs. Spencer or Widow Marlborough, she was now asserting her aristocratic status, perhaps because she understood that in a psychiatric hospital, any claim to dignity mattered. She was defiant and suspicious, refusing to sign papers, trusting only André. Her family started plotting immediately to secure control of her estate, pressuring her to sign a power of attorney so they could manage, which is to say, take her money and possessions. Gladys refused every attempt to get her signature. This fueled claims that she was mentally unsound. See, she won't sign legal documents. Clearly, she's incompetent. But Gladys understood exactly what was happening. Her family wanted control of her assets, and once she signed, she'd have no power left. The court sided with Gladys. Control of her estate went to the official solicitor rather than her family, shutting them out entirely. She'd won that battle through sheer stubbornness. She petitioned for release and was denied. She understood then that she would die confined, that freedom was gone forever. She'd fought her whole life against being trapped, in bad marriages, in social expectations, in other people's plans for her, and now she was literally imprisoned in a psychiatric hospital. Then she uncovered her nephew's plot to smuggle her art collection to Switzerland, complete with a forged letter supposedly from her authorizing the transfer. She exposed the scheme, proving that her mind was still sharp enough to catch fraud even while confined. Chacombe was sold in 1965. Her paintings were sealed in storage. Her cats were put down, those animals she'd kept as companions in her isolation, killed because she couldn't care for them anymore. Her belongings went into storage, her life packed away in boxes. Her final years were spent in a bare hospital room with only an iron bed. She clashed with nurses, finding comfort in solitude, because at least solitude was something she chose, rather than something imposed on her. But her mind stayed keen. She commented on current events, read newspapers, followed politics. She wasn't lost in dementia or confusion. She was simply old, confined, and completely alone. André remained her link to the free world, visiting regularly with flowers. He was probably the only person who treated her like a human being, rather than a problem to be managed or a spectacle to be observed. Her physical resilience was remarkable. She moved to the psychogeriatric ward, broke her hip at 90, and recovered. She relied on a wheelchair, but could still stand when she wanted to. Her fierce will and stubborn mind carried her through brushes with death that would have killed someone less determined to survive. She made tart remarks about Princess Margaret's divorce, Mao's death, Concorde flights, maintaining her sharp wit and her interest in the world, even as that world had completely forgotten about her. Once, after a fall, she briefly believed she was free, only to be brought back to St. Andrew's. The disappointment must have been crushing. Her family reappeared in her final years. George Charles Tomaszewski and his wife Betka visited, probably making sure they'd be remembered in whatever will existed, probably still hoping to access her remaining assets. In summer 1977, Gladys had her final brush with death. This time, there was no recovery, no defiant return to consciousness, no more fights left to fight. She died on October 13, 1977, at age 96, peacefully in her sleep, after a life of violence, scandal, beauty, disfigurement, obsession, rejection, confinement, and loneliness. Her death was quiet and gentle. She was buried in Chacombe's churchyard, returning to the village that had called her a witch, laid to rest in the earth of the place she'd tried to make her refuge. Christie's held an estate sale in 1978, selling off what remained of Gladys's life: jewels, a Rodin sculpture, a Toulouse-Lautrec portrait. The total proceeds were $784,000, a substantial sum, proving that even in madness and isolation, Gladys had retained valuable possessions. Where that money went, who benefited from it, remains unclear. Probably the relatives who'd tried to control her estate, who'd plotted and schemed and waited for her to die. They got their inheritance eventually. Her gravestone in Chacombe is simple. Gladys Marie Deacon, Dowager Duchess of Marlborough, 1881 to 1977. Above the inscription, carved in stone, is a single eye, her eye, still watching. It's a perfect memorial for Gladys, elegant, slightly unsettling, forever observing the world that once couldn't hold her. That eye on her gravestone looks out at visitors, at the village, at the passing years, maintaining her gaze even in death. She'd had those eyes painted on Blenheim's ceiling decades earlier, marking the palace as hers. Now one eye marks her grave, a final assertion of presence, a refusal to be forgotten or ignored even in death. So that's Gladys Deacon's. Born beautiful into chaos, became legendary, destroyed her face trying to achieve perfection, spent decades stealing another woman's husband, finally married him, and discovered it was the worst prize she ever fought for, descended into genuine madness, and ended her days in a psychiatric hospital with dead cats in her fridge and newspapers stacked to the ceiling. She was brilliant and unstable, beautiful and self-destructive, fascinating and impossible. She wanted everything: love, status, beauty, intellectual respect, and she pursued those things with a single-minded intensity that destroyed her ability to actually enjoy them once she got them. The experimental nose job at 21 was the turning point, the moment when her life shifted from scandalous but successful to slow-motion tragedy. Everything after that was damage control, attempting to maintain power and status while her face deteriorated and her mental health crumbled. But even at the end, confined in a hospital, visited only by a handyman who brought her flowers, Gladys maintained her sharp wit and her dignity. She died at 96, having outlived everyone who'd tried to control her, having survived everything life threw at her through sheer stubborn will. Her eye watches still from that gravestone in Chacombe, forever observing, forever present, refusing to disappear quietly. And if you're still awake, listening in the quiet hours, subscribe for more fascinating stories of people who lived extraordinary lives in impossible times, the brilliant minds who self-destructed, the society beauties who became cautionary tales, the aristocrats who discovered that everything they thought they wanted was actually a prison. Sometimes the best company for sleepless nights is knowing that centuries ago, someone else also made spectacularly bad decisions and somehow survived them. Sweet dreams whenever they find you.